when completing Form W-4, we want to take a look at the basic form itself first. Then in parts 2 and 3, we will look at the worksheets. So here you see we have the W-4 for 2014. In the first section, we want to go ahead and list our name. So it's best if you can type your information, but if you're not able to type your information, then at least print your name very, very carefully. Your first name and your middle initial is mentioned here. If you do not have a middle initial, then please at least put your first name and your last name. Next, it'll ask you for your home address. So I'm just going to make up a home address, any street and any city in any state, and then you want to make sure that you always put your zip code. Next, it's going to ask you for your social security number, so make sure you list it, of course, legibly. It will then ask you for your marital status, single, married, or it lists married but withhold at a higher single rate. Some people are confused by that third box. Basically what that means is if you are married but you and your spouse are filing separate tax returns, so you file as married filing separately, then you would want to go ahead and check this box. Maybe you are separated from your spouse, but you are legally married, then perhaps that would be a box you would check. So one way or the other, you would maybe think about that. But if you are married and you file your tax returns together, your checkbox would go here. Of course, single is the same as divorced, so you would check this as well for divorced. Something else you should keep in mind is single is the highest taxable category there is. So when it says married but withhold at higher single rate, some people also check the married box but withhold at higher single rate because they want to pay extra tax. Maybe they want to pay extra tax because they have a high earning category and want to make sure they don't owe at the end of the year. Maybe they want to pay extra tax because they have an old tax debt they're trying to pay down. So there could be multiple reasons, but if that may apply to you, it could be another reason that you would want to check married but withhold at the higher single rate. So this is a decision that you would have to make on your own. Okay? Also, it gives you a note down here, if married but legally separated or spouse is a non-resident alien, check the single box. So that would be also something else. So legally separated, check the single box. If you're simply separated but not on paper, and perhaps you would be filing separate tax returns because of a separation of not living in the same home, then perhaps married but withhold at higher single rate would be appropriate for you as well. Again, it's a call you will have to make, and you should possibly check with your tax advisor if you're unsure. Box number 4 will instruct if your last name differs from that shown on your Social Security card, you should check this box, and then you should also call this number to get a replacement card, and they will walk you through the steps necessary to make sure your name is recorded correctly on your new card. Number 5 asks you for the total number of allowances that you're claiming. And it says here from line H above or from the applicable worksheet on page 2. And we will cover the other worksheets in the next sections. So right now you would want to think about the number of allowances you may put in this box. After you cover the worksheets, it will be more clear to you. But generally speaking, people will think about the number of children they have living in the home, and you would want to consider the children who live with you at least 6 months out of the year. Okay? If you have a child who lives with you less than 6 months out of the year, possibly they are not your dependent legally, and you may not be able to claim them here. So keep that in mind. So count the number of children and then count yourself, and then possibly count your spouse. So you could say if you have 3 children plus yourself plus a spouse, maybe you have 5 allowances. Now, if you put 5 allowances here, you're going to pay very little tax, if any at all, possibly 0 income tax with 5 allowances, depending upon the amount of money that you make every year. So you want to consider that before you put a number as high as 5 in this box. You will want to pay tax, because when April rolls around and you file your tax return, you will want to make sure that you don't have to write a check to the IRS. So let's say you feel like you have 5 allowances. Maybe the smarter move would be to claim 2 or 3. Okay, so just keep that in mind and check with your tax advisor before you put a number as high as 5 in that box. Number 6 asks you if you would like to have an additional amount of money withheld from each paycheck. Now, certainly you are allowed to do that, but you also must list a number of allowances to claim. So let's say that you want to claim 1 allowance because you do want to have a fair amount of money withheld. And the smaller the number that you claim for allowances, the more money payroll will withhold from your check. So if you were claiming 0 allowances, then they would be withholding a larger amount of tax. Where if you claim 5 allowances, they would withhold less money from your check. So let's say you were withholding 1 allowance, and then you wanted payroll to go ahead and take an extra $50 a month from your check. You could do that very easily by just putting the $50 in here. So that would be very easy to do. And then you would be able to pay the extra tax that you felt you owe. Some people will calculate that they want to just withhold a flat amount of tax from every paycheck. Usually these are folks who earn a lot of money every pay period. So let's say that you have calculated that you would like to pay $1,000 out of every paycheck. And you really don't want to worry about a number of allowances because you know that you want to pay $1,000. Technically, the IRS won't let you do that. What you can do is come up to box 5 and put in number 99. What that will do is put you into a category where 0 tax will be withheld based on the number of allowances. And then you could come down to box 6 and you could put in that you want to withhold the $1,000. Whoops. And that would be just fine. The IRS says that you are required to have a number in box 5. So if you have a number and then you have a certain amount in box 6, you have a valid W-4. But if you leave box 5 blank and simply put $1,000 in box 6, then your W-4 is invalid. And anytime your W-4 is invalid, the payroll department has been instructed by the IRS to withhold at single and 0. And single and 0 would be up here, single and then 0 allowances. And that is the maximum amount of tax, according to the tax tables, that can be withheld from your paycheck. So you would want to make sure that you had your W-4 set at a valid setting per the IRS so that your tax can be withheld the way you want it to be instead of the default method that would be required of your payroll department. Okay? Now, something else that can cause your W-4 to be invalid and reverted back to single and zero would be if you come down to line 7 and you decide that you have an exemption from taxation and you go ahead and write in the word exempt here. If you type in the word exempt, you are in effect saying that last year you had a right to a full refund of all of your tax because you had no tax liability. And this year you expect a full refund because you expect to have no tax liability. If you meet both of those conditions, you can put exempt in number 7. Now, something that you should understand is you cannot have exempt in number 7 and then also complete number 5 and 6 or number 5 or number 6 because you have to pick one or the other. Either you want some tax withheld or you are exempt from tax. So it's not both, it's either or. Make sure that you don't check 5 and 6 and 7. Okay, so very few people qualify for number 7. You probably will not be exempt, but if you are, then please leave 5 and 6 blank and put exempt in number 7. Also keep in mind that if you are exempt, every January you will be required to give your payroll office a new W-4 signed and dated listing that you intend again that year to be exempt from taxation. If you do not feel that you're going to be exempt in that new year, then you would complete a W-4 with box 5 listed as the number of allowances that you would like to claim for that year. So keep that in mind. The general rule of thumb says that if you make $1,000 in a year, you're probably not going to be exempt. So keep that in mind as well. The threshold for exempt status is very low, but no one is going to tell you that you cannot be exempt except possibly the IRS. So if you file an exempt status and it gets you into some tax problem, then the IRS may send a letter out to your employer telling them to ignore your exempt status and begin withholding tax from your paycheck. At that point, your employer will have no choice and they will have to withhold your taxation based on IRS instruction. So you want to keep that in mind as well. Now, at any time, if any of your information on your W-4 is poorly written, if your payroll department cannot read your name or your address or anything that you handwrite, then that makes your W-4 invalid. So they would have to withhold at single zero. If your exemptions, or I'm sorry, if your allowances in box number 5 are not clearly written, they would have to withhold at single zero. So make sure that your 3 doesn't look like an 8, or a 7 doesn't look like a 2 because of you put a line through it, or something like that. Make sure it's very clear. If you make an error while you're completing Form W-4, then don't cross through it and correct it. You will want to throw the form away, shred it, and get a new W-4 and start all over, because you're not allowed to strike through and make a correction on your W-4. Your W-4 can have no errors on it at all. So you'll want to make sure it's completely clean or else it will be considered invalid. And if it's invalid and it's not corrected by you, then your payroll department is required to withhold as if you had checked box number 3 as single and box number 5 as 0, and that will be the maximum allowance for taxes per the IRS that they will withhold from your paycheck. So you want to keep that in mind, and you will want to get a corrected form to them as soon as possible if that is happening to you. So after you have completed boxes 1 through 7 and everything is very clearly written and everything, or printed, I should say, printed is the term, clearly printed, and you haven't doubled up on boxes 5, 6, and 7, you've picked one or the other, and you feel comfortable with your choices, then you will want to sign where it says employee's signature. And remember, this form is not valid unless you sign it. So if you turn in a W-4 that is not signed, then your employer will have to withhold your tax at the highest rate of single and 0, as we discussed. So sign it and then date it, and then you will hand it in to your employer at your payroll department or your supervisor, whomever is designated to accept that form from you. And then it will go into the system, and that's how your tax will be withheld from your paycheck. You can update it every year. Your employer may ask you to update it every year. It is not a requirement by the IRS, so if your employer does not ask you to, that's okay. You can change your W-4 allowances whenever you want to. So if you get a paycheck and you feel like too much tax is coming out, and let's say that you put one allowance in box 5 and you don't want quite as much tax to come out, maybe you'd want to change it and put 2 allowances in box 5, then you can do that, and then not quite so much tax will come out. And so you can find the place that you feel comfortable, that you're getting a paycheck that works for you, and then at the end of the year, when you get ready to go and file your taxes, you will be able to not owe the IRS a lot of money, possibly get a small refund, possibly not get a refund at all. The IRS says if you get more than $500 in a refund, you probably did not calculate correctly on your W-4. And if you pay more than $500 in taxes when you file, you probably did not calculate correctly on your W-4. So they want you to be $500 on either side when you go and file your taxes. And that's how you know that you were correct, you were calculating properly on your W-4. Okay? So you want to keep all of those tips in mind that we just went through. Fill this out very carefully. Check your appropriate marital status. Be very careful with box 5. Put nothing in box 6 unless you absolutely want more money taken out of your check. And then do not check box 7 at all. Do not write in exempt unless you are absolutely certain that you do not owe any tax money at all. And I must be very clear that if you received a refund last year, that does not mean that you had no tax liability. It just means that you overpaid. Okay? So possibly you paid in $5,000 in tax, but you only owed $3,000, so you received $2,000 as a refund. Okay, so you did have a tax liability of $3,000, but you got $2,000 back because you paid too much. So where it says that you had no tax liability on one of the exempt bullet points here, you wouldn't meet that criteria. So you would not be able to claim exempt strictly because you had a refund last year, okay? Because you did have a tax liability, okay? So if you had paid in $5,000 and then you got $5,000 back, then you could say you had no tax liability. Okay? So there are very, very few people who can actually say that. So be very, very careful when you check exempt on number 7, because there are few people that qualify, and you don't want to get yourself into trouble with that type of a situation. Okay? So, again, if you have questions, you do need to take them to H&R Block or whoever does your taxes every year, but do not take them to your payroll department because they cannot answer them for you. Okay? Well, this concludes part 1. If you need to listen to part 2 to discuss how to walk through the worksheet to determine your number of allowances, then click on over to part 2 and we will discuss that. Part 3 will discuss the allowances on page 2.